I don't support their vision because it destroys too many families.
One of the largest issues is change is hard.
This past winter, we had a wind chill day of -50. We couldn't get any vehicles to start, which means, unfortunately, we couldn't get out to feed the cattle.
So you feel it's displacing the ranching way of life, then?
Yes.
Would you say that the intact prairie is one of the most endangered ecosystems on Earth?
Without question.
How do the local people, the local ranchers, farmers and such, feel about what they're doing?
Many of the local ranchers here, quite frankly, were offended when they first came into the area.
Do you think by the time this is completed, you could have essentially created America's Serengeti?
Rockhopper here, and I'm out in eastern Montana, standing in one of the last remaining intact prairie ecosystems left on Earth. But there's a change on the range. Some people are happy about it, and some people are definitely not. I'm going to tell you about that and a whole lot more.
Out here, a tree is an island in a sea of grass, and the shade it offers is a precious gift. The North American prairie once stretched from southern Saskatchewan and southern Manitoba all the way through the midsection of the U.S. down to northern Mexico and covered millions of square miles. It once had one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on Earth. It was home to some 60 million bison that thundered as they ran across the plains. There were some 40 million pronghorn and tens of millions of deer and elk. There were even bears, plains grizzlies, and black bears. And the plains were once home to numerous Native Americans, tribes such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and many others. With the arrival of the white man, everything changed. Not only were the Native Americans brutally decimated and the survivors forced to relocate to reservations, but the wildlife was also annihilated. Bison were slaughtered in a vicious campaign to deprive the tribes of their food source and starve them into submission. In just a few decades, bison numbers plummeted to only about 300 animals left in the U.S. Settlers moved in and began turning the prairie into farmland. By the 1930s, almost all of the prairie lands in the U.S. had been converted to farmland, but one area still had some prairie left intact and in its mostly natural state, and that was in eastern Montana. Eastern Montana contains one of the largest intact prairie ecosystems left on Earth. It's a place of biological diversity, with numerous species of animals inhabiting the region, from insects to numerous birds, reptiles such as turtles, and mammals. Recently, due to the efforts of one organization, the region once again has the largest beast on the North American continent, the bison. Some years ago, a handful of people, realizing that this relatively pristine land still existed, set about trying to preserve it, and that didn't sit well with the people who were already here, the ranchers. The ranchers had been making a life from this land for the past 100+ years, and were befuddled by these newcomers who had set out to purchase properties as they went up for sale and reestablish creatures that were once native to the region. This is the story of when people with differing ideals cross paths. People who all share a common love for the land and the animals on it, but with differing viewpoints on how best to use and appreciate that land. I was heading across the remote reaches of the region to the Jacobs Ranch.
I'm here with Prairie Jacobs, and she's going to tell us a little bit about ranching and ranching life and what's going on out here. I've seen some signs around the area, not just Malta, but some other towns along the way, and I was kind of going, I wonder what is that about? And I see it's something with an organization called American Prairie. Can you tell me what is that exactly?
American Prairie is a 501c3 nonprofit that came into the area about 20 years ago and started buying ranches. Their goal, as I understand it, is to create a 5 million acre bison reserve. They want to see bison free roaming in this area. That would include the CMR National Wildlife Refuge, which is just south of where we're at right now. Doing that means that they have bought up some ranches, that some of those ranches have BLM leases with them, Bureau of Land Management, public lands that are attached to that specific ranch. They have purchased many ranches, not only in Phillips County, but in Valley County, Fergus County, Petroleum County, Garfield County, Blaine County. That's their 6-county area that they're working in to try to create this reserve.
This is Beth Sabo, and she is the Public Relations Manager for American Prairie. And today we're going to talk a bit about American Prairie and what it's all about. So tell me, Beth, what exactly is American Prairie?
It's a great question, and it's not always an easy answer, but to try to put it simply, American Prairie is a Montana-based nonprofit conservation organization that is working to create one of the largest nature wildlife refuges in central Montana. We're focused on preserving a fully functioning prairie ecosystem, and doing so as central Montana is composed of the Great Plains, and the Great Plains is one of the 4 places on the planet left with the potential of this landscape scale conservation. And as you probably already know, prairie grasslands are one of the least protected biomes on planet Earth. So yeah, we've been around for over 20 years and are just working to preserve prairie grasslands.
Now, I have heard that it may take some time, but you have a tremendous vision at the end of it all. Tell me about that.
So the goal is to create this wildlife refuge to be about 3.2 million acres. And so that's about 5,000 square miles of continuous land. And as you said, it's big, it's ambitious, it's audacious. The reason that we are working at such a large scale is because that's the amount of land that you need to have a fully functioning prairie ecosystem. Currently, American Prairie's habitat base is over 475,000 acres. To date, we've had 42 land transactions to achieve that number. Out of the 475,000 acres, about 138,000 are private. So those are deeded acres that American Prairie owns. And then that remaining, the difference is public land that is adjacent to or attached to the property where we have purchased land. Important to note too that a big segment of this, when we talk about 3.2 million acres, a big component of that, what we call one of the anchors, is the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. That's 1.1 million acres that has already been set aside as a wildlife refuge by the federal government. And then we also have to the west, the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, which is under 1 million acres. So that's existing public land. And what we're looking to do is purchase private and public land that is around those two already designated areas of conservation, and so that we can make one big continuous area for wildlife to migrate and move about, but also then for people to access and enjoy.
Would you say that the intact prairie is one of the most endangered ecosystems on Earth?
Without question. It truly is, yes.
So you are combining American Prairie holdings with existing federal lands, create a huge ecosystem so that animals can move about freely and you can have a great amount of biodiversity going on. Will it be restored to what it was historically before the white man arrived and have black-footed ferrets and wolves and the entire ecosystem, or will there be animals that are excluded from this?
That's the dream, right? That's the big picture goal. Obviously, there are species that have gone extinct that we can unfortunately not bring back. But yeah, I mean, ideally what we would love to see is that all of the species that are still around and that we're able to bring back in abundance are once again part of this prairie ecosystem. So that's everything from, as you said, black-footed ferrets, swift fox, bison, prairie dogs. I mean, there's an immense number of insects that call the prairie home, of bird species. You know, the prairie is an incredibly diverse area when it comes to all of the species that have used this habitat for eons.
Everybody talks about the big animals, the bison and pronghorn, things like that. Have you had success with like plants and small invertebrates, maybe like tiny butterflies or anything like that? Has that been part of your preservation mission at all?
Certainly is part of our preservation mission, in that what we hope by restoring the habitat, that all the insects, all the flowers, all the pollinators, that they also will return. As a small, lean nonprofit, there's only so much we can do. And then also wildlife. So you mentioned the little, the important butterflies, the important invertebrates. We are also very cognizant of, the large carnivores, right? That wolves and grizzlies historically lived on the prairie, that grizzly bears were a prairie species until they were pushed out by development and have become more of a mountain species. But we're seeing their return to the prairie as well, and not just because of the work that we're doing. The grizzlies have started migrating further east and out of the mountains decades ago. We don't manage any wildlife. That's up to the state. That's up to Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. That is absolutely managed by the state. Again, the reason we're able to have bison is because bison are considered livestock in Montana. But what we do hope is that by acquiring this land, by removing fences, and by doing stream restoration, beaver dam analogs, by working to restore the habitat, that we're also then helping all of these species a safe place to land. We didn't even talk about how the Great Plains are such a vitally important place for migratory birds. As they fly from the north to the south, the stopover point are the Great Plains. And so we want to make sure for those species as well that these lands are protected and that they exist in a way that they can safely land, spend a few days, nest, whatever, and then move on to the next part of their migratory journey.
This is Leo Barthelmess, and he's a rancher out here, and I'm going to talk to him. He's going to tell us a little bit about life out here and some other things. Now, there's been some talk for some time, I guess. There's the organization called American Prairie that's come into the region. Tell me a little bit about that and why some people might be a little upset by their presence in the region.
Well, I'm a rancher, and their early media presence, they indicated that they wanted to displace my ranching community. They wanted 5 million acre bison preserve, maybe even leading to another national park. And I'm in the middle of that acreage, and my neighbors are in the middle of that acreage, and I have family members in the middle of that acreage. So, needlessly to say, I wasn't supportive. Still not supportive. Anytime you come in and displace a near indigenous population, you create issues and conflicts. So, it's a grand vision, but I don't support it. And we were never asked to participate in any way, too. It was about ownership of the land and control of the land, and we were never approached about the opportunity to participate in a cooperative manner. So here we are, 20 years into it, and we're not friends. Yeah.
You're from the fourth generation ranching family in Montana, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that's from the southwest or southeast part of the state, rather?
Yep. I graduated from Hardin High School. It's down in the southeastern part of the state. Our ranch is actually located directly west of the little town of Busby, Montana. About, 15 miles or so.
And how did you end up here?
That's a really good question. My husband and I met what's becoming an old-fashioned way these days, online. And at the time, I was working in Helena at the Montana Department of Agriculture, and we made a great connection. And when I married, I had no reason to stay in Helena. I moved out here. We've been married for almost 14 years now, and I've been happy to live out here on this great ranch that's been in his family for 107 years.
So how's ranch life been treating you?
It's been up and down, very up and down. The first year I was here was the winter of 2010-11, and we had a lot of snow that winter. I thought it was more than maybe should be normal, but I didn't say a whole lot about it. And finally, when spring rolled around, and my husband admitted to me that was probably the second or third worst winter that they'd ever had out here for the amount of snow that there was. So I got indoctrinated real well my first year out here. And we had many, many good years, but recently we've been dealing with drought, grasshoppers. Mother Nature has not been kind to us here. We can have little microclimates and microbursts of things that happen. Within a 4-year span, we lost 2 buildings to wind, and then one year we had severe hailstorm that took out all the windows in the house behind me and in the other house in the yard that our hired man lives in on the west side. All the windows were taken out. We had 5 or 6 vehicles that had hail damage, tractors that had hail damage. That happened between 2019 and 2000, well, 4 years. We had something in 19, in 20, and then in 22. So, and then we're still dealing with grasshopper issues. They're not pleasant. It doesn't look bad right now, but it's drying up real fast, and the grasshoppers entirely took out my lilac hedge. The drought 2 years ago, because we weren't able to do a lot of watering, we had to buy a lot of hay that year, and hay got real expensive because everybody was in that boat. So it's an up and down environment. You just have to learn to roll with the punches if you're going to stick it out, because it's not only about a business, it's about a lifestyle that we really appreciate.
So you have to be pretty tenacious to live out here because the weather can be quite extreme, right?
The weather can be very extreme, from heavy, deep snow and blizzards that can last for days. This past winter, we had a wind chill day of -50. It was so cold, we couldn't get any vehicles to start, which means, unfortunately, we couldn't get out to feed the cattle, and they really do need that extra nutrition. Within a couple days, we were able to get at least one vehicle going and get some food to them, but it's tough on everybody when it's 50 below. About a week ago, we had 105 degrees here, so that's a 160-degree temperature swing. You learn to roll with the punches, especially when you got to be out working in that weather.
Have you had any years where you've had severe losses from just brutal weather in the winter?
No. There are different ranches have had suffered brutal losses, but we haven't because we were fortunate enough to have a little protection, or accidentally had the cattle in the exact right place they needed to be when severe weather hit. But there are many cases of severe weather killing cattle in the winter. But there's probably been more cattle lost to fires than in the summer than bad cold weather in the winter.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, we've had fires in the state of Montana where there's been herds of several hundred lost to a fire. You know, you get like this year we have a tremendous amount of forage out on the rangelands, and if lightning strike like we had Saturday, 4 days ago, had a lightning fire, and it was burning quickly from east to west. Then the wind went down and we were able to manage it and keep it under a 30-acre burn. 15 years ago we had a fire in a community, burned off about 6,000 acres in 4 to 6 hours, and if there would have been a cattle herd anywhere in that burn, we'd have lost them because we took that long to stop the fire. Yeah, it moves quick. It'll move 5 mile an hour, 10 mile an hour easily. And cattle, oftentimes, they're not familiar with fire, so they will actually not seek shelter till it's too late. And wildlife suffers from the same, you know, they're not familiar with fire either, so many wildlife are destroyed in a wildfire as well.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, I've talked to ranchers that have had to go out and euthanize their herd after a fire burned through it, and it's not fun.
Tell me about the cows out here. You've got some innovative technology going on?
We do. My brother and I run the ranch, and we've decided to pursue virtual fence. And through the fence company, we build boundaries within existing hardwire pastures to subdivide the grazing areas so that we can do a better job of targeting good species and undesirable species, and then by managing the grass intensely we can increase the amount of rest periods that the grass gets, and that all contributes to positive soil health. So, you know, our end goals, or some of our goals, are to have more vegetation per square foot, less bare ground. When rain lands on Barthelmess Ranch, we want most of it to stay in the soil profile to benefit our livestock and wildlife. Part of the regenerative ag movement that is growing by leaps and bounds yearly, you know, so we're just trying to improve our grazing to benefit our community. We have the ability to graze our cows on rangelands in the wintertime, and a lot of times in the heat of summer they won't graze really very far away from water, ponds of water. So in the wintertime we will use the virtual fence, and we will encourage or force the cows to actually graze the outlying corners of the pastures, because oftentimes they're ungrazed for periods of time, years or more, and by making the cows graze the outlying areas, it improves the quantity and quality of the grass. And while they're in those outlying corners in the winter, they eat snow instead of drink water. So It's just another tool that we've learned from our Canadian brethren north. They make their cows eat snow a lot. As long as they've got lots of vegetation to consume and little shelter from the wind, they'll do fine.
I'm going to talk with Pedro, and he's the Bison Operations Manager for American Prairie. He's a little bit camera shy, but he's got some good information, so I'm going to share that with you now. Okay, Pedro, so tell me about the bison out here. How do you manage these bison, and how many bison are there?
We have two herds. Both of them are more or less 350, 400 bison, and they are on two different properties, two ranches, two different ranches. It's a conservation herd. So all what we do is with the bison, we manage the grasslands here through grazing, and also we support another conservation herds, tribal herds. We work a lot with in the Tribal Buffalo Council and other partners around the area from the tribes, helping them to grow their bison herds as well.
Okay, so the tribes are pretty happy that you guys are out here then, helping restore
We
the
are
bison?
good neighbors. We are good neighbors with Fort Belknap. Yeah, those are our closest neighbor from the tribes, and we have a good collaboration with them. It goes less. Every season is smaller, but then with the new babies, we reach 350 or 400 on each herd. And every year we cull out part of those animals as part of our stocking rate program with the grazing. So we have to maintain the correct stocking rate of the herd on the pasture to restore the grasslands. You don't want to overgraze the pasture that you have for bison. So every year we send animals to our partners for another conservation herd and for the tribes. And also we have this public harvest program. So every year we offer this public harvest that is basically a hunt for the public. It's almost free. And we offer the support, the guidance for the orientation more than anything for the public. And then they come here every winter to harvest some of our bison. That's a really cool opportunity because that opened the gates for recreation for a lot of people that doesn't have chances to harvest the bison in another commercial hunting operation. So that's really cool. The way that we manage both herds is like we use a lot of low stress stockmanship, low stress bison handling to move them around. We don't have a lot of paddocks in the pasture. One of the units has 3 pastures and the other one has 5. And then we move the bison through the year from pasture to pasture using low stress stockmanship. So we are basically on weekly basis out there with them, moving them from one place to another, using the water holes that we know that they're going to use, and trying to point them every week, every 2 weeks to a different water point. That way they are learning the grazing pattern on new pastures, and that's how we manage the grazing.
The goal is to create this wildlife refuge to be about 3.2 million acres.
How do the local people, the local ranchers, farmers and such, feel about this, what they're doing?
Many of the local ranchers here, quite frankly, were offended when they first came into the area and said, we're going to come in and save this land. And that was very offensive to many of us because many of the ranches that are still here today, that have been here since American Prairie came in, survived the Dust Bowl years, survived the really tough years, and have made these ranches profitable businesses. I mean, I know I said it's been tough, but we're still here. We're financially still able to survive as many others are. They really offended all of us for them to come in here and think they knew how to do things any better than those of us that have generational knowledge about how this land works, generational knowledge about what the environment is, generational knowledge about ranching and what's changed and what's new and how to improve and how to keep going. I mean, ranchers would not be here if we didn't maintain a sustainable grassland that not only fed our cattle, but fed all the wildlife that's here and the songbirds and all those other things that people seem to think we don't want. We do want those things. They're an important part of the landscape. We enjoy seeing them just as much as anybody else does. So there's a lot of opposition to what they're doing. We don't have a lot of tools in our tool chest to stop them because we don't have the money that they do. And they are able to purchase private ranches when they come up for sale. And we live in a free capital society. We can't really stop them from doing that, but we're not real happy that they're here.
Another thing that apparently upsets the local people, the ranchers and such, is that they say that because you're well funded, you have the money available to simply pay cash for these ranches when they go up for sale, And I mean, that's what you do. You buy properties from willing sellers when they go up
That's
for
right.
sale, right? You're not holding a gun to anybody's head and saying, you need to sell us your property. You're not trying to twist anybody's arm too hard. You're just
Right.
going for the open market, the ranches that are available, and up for sale. Now, so their gripe is that you're well funded, you have the money to buy the ranches, whereas they, the local people, most of them actually have to take out a loan, and somehow this does not sit well with them. What do you say to that?
I would say that as a nonprofit, if it were true that we had bags of cash sitting around, just waiting to be spent and to go in and buy property with, we'd be a lot further along than having purchased 138,000 acres roughly. I completely understand that frustration and that perception. Just like a lot of other private property owners, we also have to take out lines of credit. We have mortgages on these properties. We are not coming in and always doing all cash deals. Some of our acquisitions perhaps have been purchased that way, but those were certainly smaller acquisitions. And so going back to your point, we absolutely operate under a willing seller, willing buyer model, right? We can't force anyone to sell their land to us. Not only that, we have walked away from properties where we've got, it's kind of looked like it was starting to get into a bidding war. And if there was another rancher or private property owner who was willing to pay above what we saw as the market value, we said, okay, as a nonprofit, we have a fiduciary responsibility, not only to our board, but also to our donors. And so we really have to be cognizant of we don't overpay for property. I know that's been another allegation that's been bandied about. We are seen as a competitor in the market. But I don't think that it's any different than any other rancher. A lot of ranches that go up for sale historically in Montana are acquired by a neighboring ranch that's bigger, right? And so this is something that's been occurring in rural parts of Montana for decades, long before American Prairie was ever on the scene, certainly. So yeah, we are one of many buyers that are watching the marketplace and signaling our interest in a property when one comes up for sale, just like other people in the area.
Do you feel that American Prairie failed to really communicate with the local people, the ranchers and farmers that live in this region prior to doing what they set out to do? Or?
Yeah, I don't think anybody really understood what their plan was when they first came to the area. And I would say they still don't communicate well with the ranchers in this area. We had personally had a specific issue with them in a recent request they put into the Bureau of Land Management about an allotment that is called an allotment in common. It's an allotment that not only they have the ability to graze animals in, but the Jacobs family has the ability to graze animals in. And they went to the BLM and said, oh, you need to split this allotment, and when we want this part, and you give the Jacobs family this part, and everything will be good. And they did that. They went directly to the BLM to make that request and didn't come to us and talk to us about how we felt about that, whether it was workable for us or anything like that. And in that request, if the BLM had granted that request, the BLM would have allowed American Prairie to take AUMs that we had a legal right to. We had a contract that said those AUMs were ours. BLM did the right thing and didn't honor their request, but the fact that they didn't even come talk to us before they made that request makes me say they just don't communicate still, because this is a recent event within the last 5 years, and they still don't communicate well with us.
Okay, so that's a big issue, is the lack of communication between them and the local people.
I feel it is, yes.
And you feel like they weren't very good at reaching out to the community?
No.
Not at all.
Not at all. No. And that's my opinion and many other people's opinions. So.
What are other people's thoughts on American Prairie, from what you know?
Well, in my community, I'm probably one of the kindest people that they run into, But there's people that don't like American Prairie at all. So, we work through the Rancher Stewardship Alliance. We work through a conservation committee that's part of our nonprofit, and we work with 29 different wildlife agencies and conservation groups. You know, we have a big inclusive group of people to help preserve this landscape.
They did say to me, they're upset because they feel that American Prairie didn't reach out to the community and really get to know the people, and that the American Prairie didn't really express their intentions when they arrived. Can you address that issue?
Absolutely. I think we are not naive that in the 20 plus years of this organization's history, we have perhaps been perceived by some of the people in the local communities, as you just said, as not have doing enough to reach out to them, to explain what we're doing. And we have really made a concerted effort throughout the organization's history to be transparent, to have open dialogue, to meet with community members. So I think, again, we completely recognize that perhaps not everybody understood what our vision was, what our mission was, why we were buying the land, what our intentions with the land were. But I will say that we absolutely have made huge strides in the last several years to be good neighbors, to open up a National Discovery Center in Lewistown, to have a community meeting place, to host open houses, not only in the National Discovery Center, but also out on our properties, to invite all of our neighbors and representatives from different agencies across the state to attend our bison handling, to always answer those questions and have those tough conversations. I can't tell you how many members of our staff have spent countless hours over cups of coffee at the kitchen table with our neighbors, just answering questions because they're curious. And so while I feel like it's an old narrative, but also want to recognize that there might be members of the community who still feel that way. But if that's the case, let them know that we always are an open door. We always have staff members available to answer questions, to address concerns, and to just help educate and bring awareness to what we're doing, because the last thing that we want to do is alienate any people, particularly in the communities where we work. We are proud to be a part of Central Montana, and we want to continue to work together with everybody in the area.
Okay, so you're doing your best to be good neighbors.
Absolutely, right? And just as we know that they are doing the same. Montana is one big small town. And so the last thing you want to do is burn your neighbor, because it'll come back to bite you. So I take a lot of pride. We do work really, really hard to make sure that if there are questions, if there are concerns, that we're doing everything we can to address them.
I don't support their vision because it destroys too many families.
So you feel it's displacing the ranching way of life, then?
Yes.
Do ranchers perceive this organization as displacing a way of life?
We do, yes, I would say we do. We do have a fear that if they continue to be able to buy up properties, that the ranching way of life will disappear in this area. And the sad part about that is that means that communities like the community of Malta, which is the one that our county seat that a lot of us shop in and try to do our business in, may disappear if there's not a lot of ranch families out here that can support those businesses. That just creates an economic downfall. It's would be sad to see happen. I mean, some of our communities have declined anyway just because people are moving away, and we just wouldn't want to see that happen. But we do have a fear that they are trying to do away with the ranching industry. Many of us in the ranching industry in this area feel like we help feed the world, and I don't know how they're gonna, they get rid of us and all the cattle on the landscape. There's not a lot of places that we can go to make up for the cattle that won't be produced. I mean, people like to go to their local fast food restaurant and get a hamburger. Maybe that's not going to happen in the future, or there'll be less of them.
And this ranch, personally, we feed 6,000 people. We provide the raw materials to feed 6,000 people beef. And you multiply that across our community landscape, which is millions of acres, that's a big negative impact when a lot of people can't afford food, and so we need food security in this country. So, I just question that approach to conservation.
One of the things that they said to me is that American Prairie is destroying the ranching way of life. How do you respond to that? Tell me about that.
Sure. Well, I would disagree respectfully. I don't believe that we are destroying anyone's way of life by what we're doing. We work very closely with ranchers. Actually, we have a program called the Wild Sky Ranching Program, and currently we have 16 ranchers that we work with. And I can dive more into that later. But just to get back to your general question, I think that any large scale conservation project around the world has at some point faced pushback or opposition. We know that this part of, well, in most of Montana, that so much of Montana, often you think of obviously mountains, glacier, Yellowstone, but so much of it is rural, and so much of it is prairie and grasslands, right? And so with that comes this really strong and proud ranching heritage. And ranchers should be proud of that. They have been, terrific stewards of the land for the last 100 to 150 years. So there's no doubt that there is deep pride when it comes to the ranching heritage of these communities in rural Montana. And I say that as somebody who, I grew up in eastern Montana. My uncle is a cattle rancher. My grandfather, raised wheat and raised sheep. And agriculture has incredibly deep roots in our state. And so I think that what we are trying to do, I know what we are trying to do, is we're trying to be additive. So agriculture will always remain, more likely than not, the number one driver of the economy, especially in central Montana. And we in no way are anti-cattle, anti-agriculture. We want to be additive. We want to also set aside areas where wildlife can grow in abundance, because I know a lot of ranchers who love wildlife just as much as we do, and they want to see those populations grow. And we also want to open it up for public access.
You touched on something, and I think people have a misconception of, perhaps, people from the cities might have a misconception of ranching and such, because you want to see wildlife here, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
you enjoy wildlife.
Yep.
And you enjoy ranching. And the two can coexist. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely they can coexist. When we do good things for the grasslands, when we develop water systems or develop reservoirs, that's good for the wildlife too. That gives them a place to come and water. We are in the Montana's block management program, which means we work with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks during hunting season so people can come hunt on our land. We don't keep our land locked off to anybody. Anybody can come visit any part of our land. We just request that they ask. We give them access to do shed hunting for antlers. We like to do good things for the wildlife. They're an important part of the ecosystem. Why would we not want them here?
You enjoy them as much as the next person.
That's right, I do. Yeah.
The wildlife.
Yep, absolutely.
And you do have pronghorn here?
We have pronghorn. We have a lot of mule deer. We have elk. Lots of bird species like the long-billed curlew. We have a lot of those around here, and they winter down in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, so they have a pretty long journey to get back and forth, but they come up here and lay their eggs and take their young and go south again. We have bald eagles, golden eagles, all kinds of hawks. I've seen snowy owls, great horned owls. We know there's probably mountain lions down south of here. The Little Rockies are about 30 miles west of here. They get black bears up there all the time. We have lots of wildlife, yeah.
Tell me about how you guys are good stewards of the land.
We want healthy grassland environments because that's good for our cattle and good for the wildlife. So things that we do include regular pasture rotation. We never eat it down to the ground. The general rule of thumb that a lot of good healthy ranchers operate under is leave at least 50%. Although there are intensive grazing management programs where you graze it to the ground, but then you don't come back and graze it for months, till months later. So there's a couple different grazing systems you can use to do that. That's healthy for the grass and healthy for the environment. Another example, I talked earlier about the drought of 2 years ago. We hardly had any water left anywhere. All the reservoirs were getting dry. And so and grass was hard to come by. We significantly reduced the number of cattle that we ran. Sold off a lot more than we normally would in the fall of the year. And we haven't gotten our numbers back up yet because everybody had to do that. So cattle prices are really high now that everybody wants to buy back. But that's another economic story for another day. But as good stewards, it's just important that we keep our grassland healthy, and those are some of the practices that we do around here.
You restored some grassland, is that right?
Yeah, we did. Through the NRCS, we worked with them and had some cropland that we have planted back to grassland because we're not interested in farming anymore. So we did that. We also recently put some pasture land into what they call their CRP grassland conservation program, meaning we promise we're never going to break it up and put it into cropland. And we recently signed up some acres to put into that as well. So that's another thing that ranchers are doing to try to maintain our environment.
And what exactly is NRCS?
Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's a unit of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They are able to purchase private ranches when they come up for sale, and we live in a free capital society. We can't really stop them from doing that.
They have the right to buy property and do with what they choose to, and I respect that's the American dream.
Speaking with the ranchers, I've asked them straight up, so do you believe strongly in property rights? And they say yes. And
Right.
I think what they're finding is property rights is a double-edged sword.
Right.
You can't have it both ways. And if they agree with property rights, they have to really essentially agree with your right to your property. It's an interesting dichotomy there, and I think you understand what I'm saying here, right?
It's a little bit of a sticky wicket for sure. We also wholeheartedly believe in private property rights. I mean, those are sacred in the state of Montana, and so I think the rub is that we are a private property owner who is coming in and saying we are going to manage for wildlife and public access and habitat restoration on our property. We're not trying to tell you how to manage your property, and all we ask in return is that there's been a lot of concerted efforts to try to, whether it's past legislation or lawsuits, etc., to try to control, change, dictate how American Prairie manages our private property. But yeah, it's a tough issue without question, and a little bit of NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. Also, I want to be able to do what I want to do with my own private property, but I really don't like what my neighbor's doing. I think that's been a challenge across the United States for probably over 150 years as well. So we're no stranger to the struggle. What is really reassuring and wonderful is that, as I said in the beginning, private property rights are sacred in the state of Montana, and so far they have been upheld, and we have been able to be successful in terms of restoring bison to the landscape, removing fences, modifying fences on the private property that we own.
They do agree that you have a right to your own property, however reluctantly they might say it.
Those signs were put together by the United Property Owners of Montana, or UPOM, which is a private property rights group, and yet one of their leading causes is to try to block or challenge or restrict what another entity is doing on their own private property.
Right, as we touched on before, it's that double-edged sword. They want to do what they want to do, but maybe they don't want their neighbor doing something different.
Correct, yeah.
I saw a sign coming in. It said, Undaunted Land Steward. What does that mean exactly?
Back when near the Lewis and Clark celebration, their 200-year travel through the region, they took a page off of the book Undaunted Courage, and then Montana stock growers and a bunch of Montana government entities used undaunted stewardship as a way to encourage people to come to Montana and follow the Lewis and Clark Trail. And they followed up on that. An undaunted steward is somebody that has the courage to make changes in their property and keep the landscape basically the way that Lewis and Clark saw it when they came through in 1803. There you go, 1803. So that's what undaunted stewardship is. It's about a stewardship practices that keep the landscape as Lewis and Clark saw it.
Okay, now is that something you participate in with the land?
We participated in 2003. It was funded by our senator, got funding, Conrad Burns, and he left office and the funding disappeared, different priorities. But he funded, there was, I don't know, several hundred ranches across Montana, and they also preserved and highlighted camping spots that Lewis and Clark actually used. So it was a whole mix of historic information as well as land stewardship practices to highlight the last best place, which Montana likes to refer itself to.
So what's the farthest away one ranch from another is here? Maybe 15 miles?
Oh, right now?
Yeah.
Well, the properties are adjacent. We all share boundaries. But to the north, there are 3 families, and that would be, the furthest one would be like 8 miles from here. I live just down the road a mile with my wife, and my brother, of course, lives here. And there's a neighbor right up there. You see the top of her house, that peak. And then there's a gentleman, a family that lives behind that tractor about 2 miles. So neighbors, there's a cluster of people here. Then you go about 10 miles and there's another cluster of people halfway to town. And then you go south and there's a cluster of people. And then you go further south and there's another cluster of people. So there's just less of them than there used to be.
Okay, so from one occupied house to another, the farthest distance might be 10 miles out here.
Yeah, that would be fair. And the reason there's less people, one of the reasons is the equipment. This combine will do in a couple of days what it took a homesteader, all fall to harvest. It just and the combine. This combine is 30 some years old. The ones that you'll meet going down the highway, the custom cutters, they will do 10 times what this one will. I mean, the capacity unbelievable in those machines.
So the efficiency has just gone up dramatically.
Right. So we've traded farm jobs in Montana for manufacturing jobs in the Midwest. That's basically what's happened.
You're restoring bison, you're restoring wildlife, you're preserving the prairie lands. And my understanding is eastern Montana is one of the largest remaining intact prairie ecosystems on Earth. Mongolia, I believe, is number 1.
Yep.
And then it's like 4 or 5 down the road, maybe?
We're considered, there's like 4 places. So you mentioned Mongolia, and then Patagonia, and then Kazakhstan, and then Montana. So not necessarily in that order of size, but those are the 4 places where this landscape scale conservation, where there are millions of acres of unplowed, intact grassland, where that still exists.
So this land is essentially the same as it was. It was never plowed. It was never altered in that fashion. So it is essentially the same as it was 200 or 300 years ago. Is that correct?
Correct. It's the same in that regard. It has not been plowed. It is perhaps different in that 300 years ago, the native grazer would have been a bison, and now the predominant grazer is a cow. And they do graze differently. Now, you can manage cows to graze in a similar fashion as to bison. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, I would say, generally speaking, the reason that, the land has been untouched, it is still intact. And so that is why we get asked a lot, like, well, why here? Why this part of Montana? And that's the reason why.
From talking with people such as yourself and the ranchers, it became very apparent, and it's just a fact, that the prairie needs grazers, and grazers need the prairie.
Yep.
It's just the way the ecosystem has evolved through thousands of years. And it just it boils down to what is the preferred grazer. So in the case of the ranchers, it's the cow.
Yep.
The cattle that range the lands.
Yeah.
And in your case, it's the bison.
And the reason it's the bison in our case is because, again, the mission of American Prairie is to try to restore a fully functioning ecosystem. And so since bison were the native grazer, they were the ungulate that evolved with the prairie. That's why they're a keystone species. They're an ecosystem engineer. They are the animal that existed long before any of us were there. And so that's why we focus on trying to bring bison back to the landscape. I want to make it clear, though. I know I said before we are not anti-cattle in any way. We're not anti-ag. We actually have more cows on our property than we have bison. Our bison herd is about 900. The number of cows that we have is in the thousands. I think as of late it's about 7,000. And that's because we lease grass out to ranchers because, as you said, this land does need to be grazed. Just like it needs moisture, just like it needs fire, it also needs an animal to graze it so that it remains healthy.
Now, I noticed there was a prairie fire not far away from you. Tell me about, you were talking earlier about how when the prairie burns, the carbon stays in the ground, which is different than a forest. Tell me about that.
So this is what I've been told. I don't study it extensively, but we're actually working with carbon companies to market some of that stuff. But grasslands typically store carbon around their root zones in biology that's in the soil, the fungi, bacteria, nematodes. Those all store carbon in the soil. So a prairie fire can burn across a landscape, and there will be maybe 1 year's growth of carbon in the plant above ground vegetation, but nearly all the carbon in grasslands is stored in the earth. So unless it's disturbed by some tillage or an event that disturbs a lot of soil, the carbon stays in the soil a long time. The science is still out about how much is there and how long it stays, but I've been assured by some people that 3 feet down the carbon's 43,000 years old.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so soil disturbance is about the only thing that actively dissipates it into the atmosphere.
So as long as the land remains as prairie and doesn't become agriculture, none of that carbon is stirred up.
For the most part, that's what a lot of people contend, yeah. There might be some nuances to that I'm unaware of, but that's the general consensus I hear about from grassland advocates. There might be a little prejudice because they're grassland advocates, but that's what I hear.
I've heard this many times. It's in regard to the bison. So some ranchers say that there's a risk of brucellosis being transmitted from the bison to the cattle. Now, I did some research on that, and I found that the only way that ever happened was under laboratory conditions, that it has never actually happened in the wild. There's no documented case of transmission from bison to cattle of brucellosis.
You've done your research. Yes, you stole my thunder. That's absolutely correct. There's never been a documented case of that happening in the wild.
Okay, just wanted to confirm that because I'm sure you would know. And
to just underscore that point, our bison are absolutely brucellosis free, and in much in the same way that cattle ranchers are fearful of the disease, we are too. It causes bison and cows to abort. We want our herd to be healthy. It is healthy, and so just as we care as much about the safety of our neighbors' cattle, just as we do for the safety of our bison, and for the safety of the cattle of our lessees who lease from us to raise their animals on our property and on the public land that we hold the grazing privileges to. We are required by the Department of Livestock to do regular disease testing. And we go above and beyond what is required of a typical livestock producer. We choose to do that at our own cost because the health of the herd is so vitally important to what we're doing. And the reason that we are, if this hasn't been explained, the reason that we are subject to Department of Livestock rules and regulations is because in the state of Montana, bison have a dual classification. And so the reason that we're able to have bison is because they're deemed livestock and we manage them as livestock under DOL.
In terms of our goals, our herds needs to be like really healthy. What that means for us is like the number that we have in each herd is adequate with the offer that the grassland has for them. So that way we don't overgraze. There's a lot of concern with bison about jumping fences and getting away. And that happened, I have seen that happening in other places where I have worked before, but that's where they run out of grass or they run out of water. So as long as you provide for the correct amount of animal, the correct amount of grass and water, they are gonna be happy and they stay just calm. We don't manage them like in a intensive way because it's a conservation herd, so we don't mess with the social structure and we don't mess with movements outside of the key seasons like calving and rut. That's the breeding season for them. We are monitoring them every now and then, but we are not moving them during those seasons. Since we are there, they know us. So they know me, they know my team. And then if we need to take them from one place to another, they trust a lot in the handlers and I to move them around. So that simplifies a lot of things and that makes safe the operation for everybody. In terms of the structure, we are working and get a better structure of the population. Like we want a healthy group of females that are on the reproductive stage with the correct percentage of the bulls, and that way we are having a nice and healthy calf crop of new baby bison every spring. And that helps us to meet our goals with grazing here, to restore habitat to grazing with bison, and then our goals with other partners that they are collaborating with us to grow another herds, and that way we know what we have to share with them. We do monitoring every year to check all the ecological benefits that the bison on the land has. So bison has a different way to graze that cattle. Cattle lost their herd instinct so many years ago because of the selection for breeding for European breeds, but bison still have it. So bison will graze in density by themselves, and that's what you want, like a certain density and animal impact on the landscape. So every bison hoof is a little glass of water on the grassland. So every time that there's a bison with a hoof print in a mud, that mud will dry out, but the glass of dirt is gonna stay there for the next rainy season, and it's gonna hold water. The buffalo wallows are very interesting. That's where they rub. They take these dirt pads on the ground, and they create these small pools. So those little pools are going to collect water, and then it's a kind of a jump start to the ecological cycle of nutrients and ecological cycle of water, because they hold water there, and then when there's good seed bank, so you're gonna have germination of good vegetation there, and in the meantime, that little pool of the size of a bison is habitat for little insects and little frogs and lizards, and it's very interesting when you find one of those. The other thing is that up here in Montana, we have really harsh winters. In the spring, the cold during the spring is really long. You can have snow on the beginning of June or mid-June sometimes. So all the grassland birds spend the breeding season out here. The northern Great Plains is really important for migratory grassland birds. They breed up here. Very interesting how you can find the wool of the bison on the nest of these birds. So they use the manure and they use the wool and the hair from the bison to warm up their nest during the spring. Because even if the weather is warmer, then almost every 2 weeks you have freezing temperatures or hailstorms or snowstorms from the summer and the spring. I think that 2 weeks ago they just have one up here in the Little Rockies. And that wool that the birds collect from the bison is also helpful to keep the birds warm. So that's another benefit in terms of conservation, that there's a lot of animals getting advantage from the bison. But they graze different. They are more selective than cattle, but they thrive way better with poor nutritional plants. So they evolve to thrive and get the nutrition from a lower quality of forages. There's a lot of things that we call in the bison world the bison advantage, because they need less water, they can go longer without water, they can resist the heat better, and they get better nutrition that another grazer animals from the same quality of grass, even if it's a low quality. So yeah, there's a lot of benefits.
Well, tell me some of what you would consider successes that have occurred so far, and maybe some of the successes you hope to see in the future with all of this.
Oh, that's a great question. I think the fact that we are approaching 1,000 animals in the size of our bison herd is incredibly successful. We've restored bison to the landscape starting in 2005 after a 120-year absence. And, the herd has grown from those initial, I think it was 16 animals to now over 900. And we recognize that once we reach 1,000, that's an important milestone. They're becoming closer and closer to serving their, ecologically significant role that we want them to serve. So the growth of the bison herd has been tremendous to see. Over the years, we've also donated or distributed over 500, I think it's actually over 550 bison to other conservation herds around the country. The majority of those have been tribally managed. So we've been an active partner in trying to help bison restoration efforts, particularly in the West. So that's feels like a really big win. We've grown the Wild Sky Ranching program I mentioned earlier. We've grown from a handful of ranchers to now we have 16. And I can dive into that if you'd like. Just as an overview, this is a program we created to work directly with our ranching neighbors. And so what it is a way for them they volunteer to sign up, and they volunteer to do any number of things on their property, on their home property. The only requirement that we have is that they don't till up native grassland, right? And then other things they can do, they can put in wildlife friendly fencing, they can do plague mitigation to help their prairie dog colonies. There's all sorts of things that they can do. And then in return, at the end of the year, we send them a check. So that's one part of the Wild Sky program. The other part of the program, which we've seen a lot of great success is our cameras for conservation. And so that's where the Wild Sky Ranchers elect to put camera traps at various points around their property. And every time they capture an image of an elk, a coyote, a mountain lion, deer, even a bear, they get a check from us. And that program does cap out at $6,000 per year. And we do have a few ranchers who have been meeting that annually now for a while. And the reason for that is what we're trying to show is that, and we've heard even from the ranchers like, holy cow, I didn't realize I had mountain lions on the back 40. And we're seeing them, and now I'm getting paid to create this social tolerance that I'm seeing that they can maybe wander through and there's no depredation, right? There's no harm being done to my sheep, my cows, etc. And so they're doing this to help grow that social tolerance piece that we want wildlife to be able to migrate through without running into harm's way. We've seen such great success in our National Discovery Center. That was opened in the fall of 2021. We did that. It's on Main Street in Lewistown. We managed to open this beautiful visitor center, still with COVID lingering. And what we have seen last year, we had 5,500 people pass through the doors. We are offering all kinds of educational programming. We have a community meeting space. We have a children's play center. And so it's just been a really great way for us to further engage with particularly members of the Lewistown community. And so that's been a real success. We've launched our American Prairie Field School. So this is a program for students grades 5 through 8. And we have a couple different programming options. We have a overnight field school opportunity where Montana kids come out and they get to spend a couple nights at our Antelope Creek campground where they camp out, and then they do spend 2 or 3 days learning about prairie ecology. A popular part of that is that we've partnered with members of the Fort Belknap tribe, and they come out and they show them various like Indian relay games and native games that they're able to play. So we have, since the field school has been around, we've been able to educate like over 500 Montana students. We also have one-day programming where they come to the National Discovery Center and learn about the prairie and about bison and about the flowers and prairie dogs and antelope and all the other things that exist out there as well. And so we've just seen a real outpouring of support, particularly for the educational stuff that we're trying to do. I've done tremendous work partnering with our Indigenous partners at Fort Belknap, at Fort Peck, and at Rocky Boy, and other tribal nations across Montana, even into South Dakota and North Dakota, Wyoming as well. Not only with bison restoration, but again, also with them coming to speak to our visitors, coming to educate our visitors about this land that was historically occupied by Indigenous peoples. And that's been a really wonderful progression to see. And as we try to become even more inclusive and bring more awareness and education to, you know, these historically tribal lands, and the very important role that our Indigenous partners are having in conservation work. They are often at the forefront of reintroduction efforts. They've been able to reintroduce swift fox on Fort Belknap. You know, they have been able to go out and spot the black-footed ferret on the reservation up there. And so we look to them often and follow their lead.
And you're having great success working with the tribes, right?
We are. We're having tremendous success. In the last year, we were really excited to purchase a property that finally made us fence line neighbors. That's our wild horse property. We're fence line neighbors with Fort Belknap. And as I said earlier, we work with them very collaboratively on almost everything that we do, just because they are leaders in the conservation effort. They're leaders in rewilding efforts. We recognize everything that they bring to the table, all of their knowledge and vision and ambition and desire. And not only that, but obviously how culturally significant the bison is for our Indigenous neighbors. And so, yeah, we want to do everything that we can to honor those relationships. And, you know, we see it as a win-win, as we hope that as American Prairie continues to see success and grow, that our partners on the various reservations will also continue to see success and grow in all of the things that they're doing as well.
Does it get harder as time goes on to make a living ranching, as costs go up for everything?
Yes, yes. Our percentage of the food dollar shrinks every year. You know, so it's harder for us, because when my dad was ranching, I think the beef share of the food dollar the consumer paid was about 40 cents or 40%, and now it's hovering around 10. Yeah, it's very difficult. And used to be, there was points in the history that you could buy land and pay for them with livestock grazing. That's no longer possible at all.
Those days are gone.
Those days are gone, yeah. So you need to add other enterprises or something to acquire that property, pay for it.
You try to be a good steward of the land as a rancher, right?
We work diligently at it, because the only resources we have to add value to are healthy grasslands, and we harvest that grass with cattle and sheep. There's some ag operations have an opportunity to earn income from hunting and things like that, but we personally don't have that opportunity here. So we just add value to grasslands by harvesting the vegetation and moving the marketable animals into the food chain. And we have to do that year after year after year, or we can't mine the soils, because we have to maintain it as a renewable resource.
Would you mind telling us how many head of cattle you run on how many acres, and do you have a lease for land such as BLM?
Certainly. So I'll start with the land portion, because everything springs from the land. We manage about 25,000 acres, half of which is private and half of which is lease land, and most of the lease land is federal land under the management of the Bureau of Land Management. We have a good relationship with the Bureau of Land Management. They have stewardship practices that they need to fulfill, and we honor that and work with them to create healthy rangelands and sustainable rangeland. And they're very supportive of our grazing management and the fence products that we use, so they were instrumental in allowing us to participate in that program. We run about 600 cows, and we lease other private properties for grazing during the summer, during the spring, so we lease a couple of different properties. It's very difficult to buy land anymore because we have a lot of Wall Street influence out here. Not only is American Prairie pushed the price up with their land purchase, but there's other people have come out here and bought properties as well. So, and typically a cow will not pay for the land anymore. So, they buy the land and we lease it from them to graze. And we're providing a stewardship for them, because these rangelands were grazed for hundreds of thousands of years. So if you take the grazing animals off that, the grasslands will fail over time. It's been proven time and again that without grazing, these grasslands will fall apart.
Yeah, so grasslands need grazers.
Grasslands need grazers because they evolved together over hundreds of thousands of years. Cattle's just the latest grazer here, and it was bison and woolly rhinoceroses and little bitty horses back in the day. I mean, we're talking way back in the day, but yeah, mammoths and mastodons and all kinds of, animals grazed out here. Just to remove a grazer is inappropriate. And right now, there's only enough cattle to do it. I mean, there's only, less than 1 million bison in America, and there's 30 million cows. So if you eliminate all the cows on the rangeland, you still don't have enough bison to backfill and make the ecology work.
So in your estimation, grazing cattle is preferable to bison?
No, grazing cattle is preferable to no grazing at all. The cattle have a byproduct in the fact that they're food. Bison generally are photo icons. There's some of them that go into the food market, but to produce the amount of food that cattle do across the continent, it'd be very difficult for bison to duplicate that. And there could be some food insecurity because of that. If I could make money raising bison, I would look seriously at it, but to change from cattle to bison, that's an expensive business, and the price of bison doesn't guarantee that it's going to be profitable in the future either, so it's just not worth the risk to look at it seriously. There's lots of bison ranches around the American West and even in the East. In 2008, the manager for Ted Turner's Bison Ranch, a Flying D, he came to Malta for a 2-day Ranching for Profit seminar, and he talked about their numbers, and their cost of production was very nearly the same as beef cattle, but they were marketing their bison through Ted Turner's restaurant chain, so they had a higher, sale price, let's say. But his cost of production wasn't that much better than ours.
I have worked a lot with regenerative grazing using cattle, and it works perfect. But the main difference is that bison graze in a herd in density by nature. They tend to stick together by nature. You will see during the year this seasonal separation of groups, but with cattle, depending on the breed, you have to go and teach them how to behave as a herd. And they grasp it. The cattle grasp it in 10 days. It's already reboot as a herd instinct, but you have to go and teach them. Because of the ways that we managed cattle in the past, we removed that herd instinct from there. So it's like a sheep. They still having all the wires on the head to behave as a herd animal, but those wires were disconnected in the past because the properties were smaller. There were no need. You have barbed wire, so there were no need of a cowboy to be taking care of the cattle out there all the time and keep them together. So the predators went away. So there's no more large predators in the area like wolves that will keep those packs of cattle together. So they kind of relax. We can say that the cattle are kind of evolve in a kind of relaxed way where they didn't need to be as a herd to survive. And then you mess with them, there's a way to train them to behave as a herd again. And that works really good. The advantage with bison is that they still having that instinct because they are wildlife, so that chip never went away.
So the bison never loses the herd instinct.
Never loses the herd instinct. So you will see bison in a pasture that maybe is too big for some people, but when you spend a lot of time with them, you can see how even if they are a mile away, they belong to the same herd, and they are communicating from a mile away, and they will react depending on what the other group of bison is doing. So they still connected. The thing is that they work in family/friendly groups. There's this family group, and they are the best friends of the family. So you will see little groups of, I don't know, between 20 and 40 animals maybe. That is like a neighborhood, right? Or it's like a block, and then the whole neighborhood is the herd, and then the guys from the other block are in I don't know, a mile away in a group of, I don't know, 120, but they belong to the same herd. And you move one of them, and the first thing that they are going to do is going towards the other group. Like the first thing, why are they going that direction? There's nothing there, but then the thing is that maybe you can see the other group behind the hill, but you know, like, oh, you want them to go north and they go west, and you say, oh, okay, I guess we got to go first to the west, pick up the rest of the animals that they know that they are there, and they're trying to take them north. So you have to learn their ways.
Do you think by the time this is completed, you could have essentially created America's Serengeti?
Gosh, you know, I wish that was the case. I think the term American Serengeti implies, for me, it implies tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of animals, of wildlife. When I think of what was referenced as the American Serengeti, that was really this time period when the wildlife populations were in such incredible numbers. I don't want to say no, but I don't think in my lifetime we're going to see populations rebound in that high number. And not only because there are so many other competitors for the habitat, there are humans in existence now in a way that there were not when, we had an American Serengeti. And so there's other things that are competing for the same area of land. So while we might not see the wildlife in those numbers, what I do hope is that once the project's complete, it will lay the foundation for maybe that will come in centuries down the road.
The bison are not what you would, they are free-ranging in a sense, but they are confined by eventually fences. Exactly. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's you hit it on the head. Yes. So while, like on our Sun Prairie unit, we have removed some internal fences to allow them, tens of thousands of acres to roam internally, they will eventually hit that perimeter fence, which is electrified, and that will stop them from getting out. Hopefully, it happens. I'm sure you probably spoke with ranchers who have talked about it, and cows get out too. It happens at the same rate that we've had just as many cows in our bison pasture as we've had bison hop a fence and get into our neighbor's pasture. So, and that's why, again, going back to why it's so important for us to have good working relationships with our neighbors. And I do want to point out where it sounds like you spoke with ranchers who perhaps, not fans of what we do. We have wonderful relationships with the majority of the people who own land approximate to American Prairie, to our direct neighbors. We've been there now for a long time. They've gotten to know us. And we also have a lot of great support amongst ranchers that maybe that aren't adjacent fence line neighbors, but we see driving down the road, all the time, and that they come to our bison handling, or maybe we go help them as out with a fencing project or branding, etc. So we do work really hard and have made a lot of great strides and have really good relationships with a lot of ranchers in the area, despite what it might seem like or what you might hear. And I think it's important to remember, and I say this as a native Montanan, we are a beautifully big state. There's something like over 90 million acres of Montana that we all get to enjoy, and 58 million acres of that is already in ag production. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about 3.2 million acres where we want to see that portion set aside for wildlife, for people. When you think of it in those numbers, it doesn't seem like should be so impossible. It seems like there's enough room on the landscape for both of these things to exist. There's already 58 million acres of land being used either for farming or for livestock production. So we're just talking about roughly 3 million acres set aside for wildlife and people to enjoy.
I think everybody in Montana really loves wildlife. So we should really concentrate on the shared love of wildlife that everybody has, instead of nitpicking at what each other is doing, maybe.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I really meant what I said, that some of the largest wildlife lovers I've ever met in my life are ranchers, because they know the land and they get to see those elk or deer, on a daily basis. They see them on their property. And so that I think it's important to emphasize that it's easy to try to draw divisions between us and them. And we don't want that. It's not a zero-sum game for us. We actually have far more in common, as you said, our love of wildlife being one of the large things, far more in common with ranchers and others who may not agree with how we manage our property. And that's actually been one of the biggest pleasures of working for American Prairie, is that getting to sit down with somebody who initially is skeptical or has questions or maybe is straight out opposed. And you just talk about, here's actually what we're doing. You might have heard this, but guess what? We do pay our property taxes. We do allow hunting. I just want to emphasize that what we hear day in and day out is, while you might see the signs, you might hear people speaking out, what we see, what our staff sees, is that more people are in support of what we're doing. When they hear about what we're doing, they get excited, they want to learn more. And so every day, more and more people are coming out, at least, and letting us know that they support the work that we're doing. They're happy that we're operating in central and eastern Montana, and they want to learn more because they understand the importance of working to protect the prairie ecosystem. If it's never been something you've contemplated, considering visiting the prairie.
So the biggest reason that we're losing prairie land is because it's being converted to farmland?
Yeah. So the main cause of habitat loss in the grasslands of North America is the change on the use of the land. When you transform that to croplands, then you are changing the land use.
So bison meat is actually healthier than cattle?
It depends, as everything. There's this grass-fed beef that they raise their cattle only on grass or with minimum inputs like hormonal and or supplements. The inputs are minimum, so that is considered like a grass-fed beef because they are growing from the grass. That's a really good meat. You send a bison to the feedlot, then all the benefits of the bison meat are almost gone. But if you are raising your bison on grass, then you will get all the benefits from the bison meat. So it's low in fat and really high on omega oils, like omega-3, omega-7, those good oils that you want from the fish, from the salmon, all that, you will get them from a really good grass-fed meat. And bison evolved like that. Bison evolved in a way that they will perform, gain weight, getting fat just on grass. It's really healthy meat. And then I have heard, like, we have a neighbor here that he has some health issues. He cannot eat red meat from beef cattle, but he's allowed to eat bison meat. I'm not sure exactly what's the process there, but he can eat bison meat.
We have a campground now off of 191, Highway 191, north of Lewistown. And we have 3 huts now out on the PN, which is near the confluence of the Missouri and Judith Rivers. It's near Winifred, Montana. And we saw 6,000 overnight visitors last year at both our huts and campgrounds. So being able to host people out on the prairie has been incredible because even as somebody that grew up in this landscape, I think you take it for granted and you don't really understand the beauty of it until you're out on it and you see an incredible sunrise or an incredible sunset. You get to look for miles. It's where the name Big Sky Country came from. You can look up and see the blue sky and the white clouds, and it just goes on and on and on. So, becoming more of a place that is tangible for people to visit has been really, really rewarding. And we just continuously hear how grateful people are to explore a new area, a new part, a new landscape that they maybe previously hadn't considered as a place to visit.
And speaking of big sky, let's not forget the fantastic night sky with all the stars.
Yes.
It can be quite amazing.
It is. It is actually one of the darkest places in the U.S., in North America, and we're working on getting, hopefully someday, our dark sky designation, because the stargazing out there is absolutely incredible.
I just want to make it clear to everybody that you welcome the public. You welcome them with open arms. You want to have them come, stay, camp, and enjoy the beauty of the land that exists and the animals on that land, right?
Yeah, you said it very well. Yeah, we try to be. We want to be incredibly welcoming. We want people to come out and experience this unique landscape. We want them to understand that the prairie is the least protected, but it should be one of the most protected because it's disappearing at an incredibly alarming rate. And we recognize that it's crazy sometimes to try to wrap your head around 3 million acres. What does that look like? We're one of the most ambitious conservation projects in North America right now. We're open, we're welcoming, we want visitors to come out. If nothing else, explore our website. It's americanprairie.org, and there are amazing pictures and a ton of information just to start, researching a possible trip or just to learn more about what we're doing, and also why this part of the world is so important, and so important that we try to protect it and keep it intact.
I just think it's important for everybody to remember that if you eat, you are involved in agriculture.
Our ranch philosophy, and we're typical of many ranchers, we just want to leave it better than we found it, and more vegetative cover on the soil and less bare ground, and retain more water and on the land, and support more life, just in the soil and above it. That's basically what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and wildlife.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's an important part of this landscape. Without them, then it's not unique at all. Part of what makes it unique is the quantities and quality of wildlife we have. Our personal philosophy and a lot of the people that we work with, we're going to try and create sustainable, regenerative, profitable ranches and pass it on to the next generation to provide for, managed wildlife habitat that supports everything Lewis and Clark saw, and provide food security for the country, because we're in a regenerative business. If we don't create continuous, be able to use these rangelands year after year, we're going to be out of business.
So what I'm hearing is that ranchers can provide food for the people and also be very good land stewards. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This region we live in, which is part of the reason there's so much conservation interest, this is supposed to be the largest intact grassland left in the world. This region from southern Canada including southern Canada to Roundup, Montana, Yellowstone Valley, let's say, Billings. It's mostly ranch land. There's been some continuous farming or tillage, but for the most part, these are huge blocks of grasslands out here.
Okay, so the consensus among the locals is they feel most strongly that American Prairie has
come in and displace their way of life?
Yes, that's about the quickest capture of the event. That's generally the consensus, that they didn't value the stewardship and the quality of conservation the ranchers had done since the failure of the Homestead Act because of drought in this area. So they think the introduction of a wild species will correct, homestead problems and land abuse. And generally, that's not the case.
The main failures of American Prairie were lack of communication, not really reaching out to the community, not telling the community of their intentions,
Right?
and everybody has this overwhelming feeling of being displaced as a ranching community.
Yes.
Because their intention is to restock the land, the prairie, with wild, so to speak, bison.
Yes. Yes.
And that just doesn't bode well for the locals.
It doesn't bode well for my community, no.
Do you think as time goes on that local ranchers will be able to reach out to the people at American Prairie and potentially work with them a little more? Or do you think that they're just so entrenched in their own way of life that they really don't have any interest in doing that?
I think that's probably the case for most people, and I don't think the ranchers are ever going to reach out to American Prairie. Not very many of them. There are ranchers that graze their properties because they buy a ranch, and oftentimes they are unable to stock it with bison, so there are ranchers that lease the grass back from them. Maybe even the person that sold it to them will continue to graze cattle, but it's going to be a long time before there's reconciliation and opportunity to work together, because both camps are pretty well entrenched. It's unfortunately a simple thing, cattle versus bison.
I think that one of the largest issues is change is hard, and these are families who have been on their ranch for decades, if not over a century, that they watched their great grandfather, father, etc. They watched all of their ancestors take care of, and so it is hard to accept that perhaps someday the lands that they have known to be operated in a certain way might be operated in a different way. And again, that goes back to we can't force anyone to sell to us. We certainly wouldn't want anyone to sell if they don't agree with how that land is going to be further operated or managed. But I think this is just unfortunately a trend that we are seeing across the West, that ranching is an incredibly hard business. It's an incredibly hard industry. I watched my grandfather, go through it for all of his life. Sometimes your margins are razor thin. You're at the mercy of the marketplace. You're at the mercy of Mother Nature. We know that the drought that we've been experiencing for years in the West has had major ramifications for farmers and ranchers across the board, and it's been incredibly hard for them to sometimes maintain the same numbers that they were able to previously. I just want to reiterate and empathize that we understand that change is hard for people, and that's why we really do try to be good neighbors, and we want to work with the people who live and have lived for as long as they have and have been wonderful stewards of the land in Montana.
As they say, the only constant is change, and change has now come to this remote corner of Montana. Perhaps one day there will be more of a spirit of cooperation between the ranchers and American Prairie. After all, the ranchers have a long history of working the land and an intimate knowledge of that land. And the people at American Prairie have a knowledge of the plains animals and their historic significance out here and the ecosystem they inhabit. Maybe someday they'll put their differences aside and focus on their commonalities, a love for the land and the creatures on it. How you perceive this situation depends largely on how you view history. Historically speaking, the rancher is a relatively new arrival. Prior to that, there were the Native Americans living here for many centuries alongside the tremendous herds of bison and other animals. Some think we should give the land back to the tribes, though there might be disagreements as how to best graze the land and which animals to utilize for that. I think everyone's starting to see that these are all good people on each side, regardless of ideology. There are no villains here. Maybe someday tensions will fade away like the signs that were hung up years ago. All agree that the prairie needs to be grazed. It's just a matter of what creature is best to be on the range doing the grazing. I didn't have any problem with anyone on either side. I only was uncomfortable with feeling that I had entered a chemically addicted region where poisons were sprayed on the ag fields so common around here, and what I would guess was mosquito spray was being applied in Malta's city park while people were still in it.
I hope you enjoyed exploring the largest remaining piece of prairie in the American West and meeting the people who live it and love it. Don't forget to give me a like in the video, share, and subscribe. Until next time, this is Rock Harper. I'll see ya.